So here's what just went down, and I need you to grasp the full weight of this moment. Because what we're watching unfold right now is nothing less than a complete transformation of North American trade as we know it. Canada just went all in on its China deal. And I'm not talking about some minor policy tweak or a gesture for the cameras. I'm talking about Prime Minister Mark Carney's government staring down Donald Trump's threats, his bluster about 100% tariffs, and saying, "We're doing this regardless." Let me take you through exactly what happened, because the details here aren't just important, they're everything. In January, Mark Carney boarded a plane to Beijing, not Washington, Beijing, and while he was there, Canada and China locked in a sweeping trade agreement that fundamentally rewires the economic landscape of this continent. China agreed to cut tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports. We're talking canola, lobsters, peas, genuine products from genuine Canadian farmers and fishermen who've been getting squeezed and underpaid for years. But here's the part that has Washington completely unraveling. Canada slashed its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to just 6%, and opened the gates to up to 49,000 Chinese-built EVs entering Canada every single year. Now, Trump had put Canada on notice. He'd stood up in January and threatened 100% tariffs on every Canadian export if this deal went ahead. 100%. He literally declared that Canada would become nothing more than a backdoor entry point for Chinese goods aimed at the American market. The usual fearmongering, the usual strong-arm tactics that have poisoned US-Canada relations for far too long. And you know what Carney did? He signed it anyway. Let me explain why this is so much bigger than a few numbers on a trade spreadsheet. For decades, Canada has been economically shackled to the United States in a way that's been, and let's not dance around it, suffocating. About 75% of Canadian exports have historically gone south of the border. That level of dependency gives the United States staggering leverage, and American administrations, one after another, have used that leverage, sometimes with a scalpel, sometimes with a wrecking ball. Trump's tariff threats weren't invented out of thin air. They were just a louder, uglier version of pressure that's always existed. But what Carney is doing, what this China deal actually represents, is Canada finally declaring that enough is enough. His administration's goal is to dramatically grow non-US exports by 2035. They're not talking about small adjustments at the edges. They're talking about fundamentally rebuilding Canada's trade relationships so that no single country, especially not the United States, can ever again hold the Canadian economy hostage. And the timing couldn't be more perfectly ironic. Because right now, as this plays out, American pressure tactics are backfiring in spectacular, almost poetic fashion. Trump believed his 100% tariff threat would make Canada flinch. Instead, it turbocharged Canada's pivot toward China. It handed Canadians a living, breathing example of exactly why diversification is essential. It made the argument for Carney's entire strategy better than any campaign speech ever could have. Let's talk about who's winning right now, today, because this isn't some distant hypothetical. Real Canadian industries are already seeing real, tangible results. Take the beef industry. China has reopened its market to Canadian beef after a ban stretching back to 2021. Think about what that actually means for Canadian ranchers, for processing plants, for the communities built around the cattle industry. We're talking about renewed access to one of the world's most enormous beef markets. Jobs returning, revenue flowing, stability returning to towns that have been quietly hurting for years. Canadian farmers growing canola, hauling in lobsters, harvesting peas. They now face dramatically reduced tariff barriers entering the Chinese market. These aren't symbolic gestures designed to look good in a press release. These are concrete, immediate economic benefits that translate directly into better paychecks and better lives for Canadian agricultural workers. And then there's the electric vehicle piece, which deserves its own conversation. By opening Canada's market to Chinese EVs at slashed tariffs, Canada is positioning itself at the leading edge of the electric vehicle revolution. These are affordable, high-quality vehicles that Canadians genuinely want and can actually afford. The American auto industry has been sluggish to adapt, overpriced, and frankly out of step with where consumers are heading. Chinese manufacturers have been running circles around everyone else on EVs, and Canada just decided to let its citizens actually benefit from that, rather than shielding a struggling American auto sector behind a wall of protectionism. Now let's look at Washington, because the reaction there tells you everything you need to know about how badly this has blown up in American faces. Trump and his inner circle are in full scramble mode, because what they're suddenly realizing, probably too late, is that their intimidation playbook has expired. Canada called their bluff, held the cards, and won the hand. Think about it from the American vantage point for a moment. They've leaned on economic dominance over Canada for so long that they genuinely forgot Canada has options. They forgot Canada is a G7 nation sitting on vast natural resources, home to a highly educated workforce, and entirely capable of forging partnerships with other major global players. When Trump brandished that 100% tariff threat, he thought he was swinging a sledgehammer. What he actually did was show every Canadian exactly why their country needed to stop being so dependent on the United States. He handed Carney the perfect political ammunition. He made the case for the very policy he was trying to kill. And now American businesses are the ones staring at the consequences, because if Washington actually follows through on those tariff threats, American consumers lose access to Canadian lumber, Canadian energy, Canadian food, Canadian automotive components. Supply chains woven together over decades would tear apart overnight, costs would skyrocket, and shortages would ripple through the economy, all to punish Canada for having the audacity to conduct an independent trade policy. Let's also be direct about something. China is winning this exchange, comprehensively. Beijing didn't threaten a soul, didn't bully, didn't posture. They simply showed up with a fair deal. One that treated Canada as a genuine partner rather than a junior subordinate. And in doing so, they've carved a wedge between the United States and one of its most historically loyal allies. China publicly stated that this trade deal targets no third parties, diplomatically gracious, but everyone understands the subtext. China gets expanded Canadian market access, gets a North American foothold for its electric vehicles, and gets to show the entire watching world that there is a credible, reasonable alternative to American economic dominance. That's not just a trade win. That's a geopolitical masterclass. They didn't fire a single shot. They just had to be reasonable while America was being unreasonable, offer partnership while America offered threats. And now every other country on earth is watching. Watching Canada successfully break away from American economic dependency. Watching U.S. pressure tactics collapse in real time. Watching China cement its image as a stable, reliable trade partner. The implications stretch far beyond canola fields and EV showrooms. There's something much deeper running through all of this that gets swallowed up in the noise of tariff percentages and trade volumes. This is about sovereignty. This is about Canada asserting its fundamental right to make its own economic choices, without clearing them with Washington first. For too long, there's been an unspoken rule. Canadian governments needed to factor American preferences into their major decisions before Canadian ones. That was never partnership. That was subordination. Wearing a diplomatic mask. What Carney is doing is ripping off that mask. Canada is a sovereign nation. It will make decisions rooted in Canadian interests, full stop. If those decisions happen to align with American preferences, fine. If they don't, well, that's what an independent country looks like. You can feel exactly how threatening this is to the American establishment, because if Canada can successfully assert economic independence, the precedent is set. What's stopping Mexico? What's stopping nations across Latin America, Europe, and Asia from running the same calculation? The entire architecture of American economic dominance rests on other countries believing they have no real alternatives. Canada is demolishing that belief in real time. And that terrifies Washington. Let me zoom in on the electric vehicle piece specifically, because this is where the contrast between forward-thinking Canada and backwards-looking America becomes almost impossible to ignore. The future is electric. That's not a political opinion. It's an engineering and economic reality. And right now, Chinese manufacturers are the undisputed global leaders in producing quality EVs at prices ordinary people can afford. Companies like BYD are building cars that consumers want, at price points that don't require a second mortgage. The American response has been to erect tariff walls, prop up legacy automakers who've been slow to innovate, and keep producing vehicles that can't compete on the world stage. That protectionism might paper over some cracks in Detroit this year. But long-term, it just means American consumers pay more for less, while the rest of the world moves on without them. Canada chose a different road. by dropping Chinese EV tariffs. The Carney government is saying, "We want our citizens driving the best vehicles at the best prices. We're not going to kneecap our climate goals or pick our consumers' pockets to protect an American industry that won't adapt. And here's the thing. It's going to work. Canadians will buy these vehicles. Emissions will drop faster. Climate commitments will get closer. And every manufacturer, including American ones, will face actual competitive pressure to get serious about innovation. That's how a healthy market functions." Meanwhile, American consumers will keep writing bigger checks for vehicles that can't keep pace globally. That's not Canada's burden to carry. That's a problem America built for itself. The agricultural dimension of this deal deserves far more attention than it's been getting, because this is where the immediate, ground-level impact for everyday Canadians is most visible. Canadian beef producers just got back into the Chinese market after being frozen out since 2021. That's not a minor diplomatic footnote. China is one of the most massive beef markets on the planet, and Canadian ranchers produce some of the finest beef anywhere. Being locked out of that market for years has quietly devastated family farms, processing facilities, and entire communities built around the cattle industry. That market is now open again, not because of American generosity, because Canada went out and negotiated for its own people. Same story for canola farmers, lobster harvesters, pea producers. These are Canadians making honest livings who now have meaningfully better access to a market of 1 billion people. Reduced tariffs mean their products are more competitive, which means more sales, more jobs, and more stability for agricultural communities that have been running on fumes. And what has the American response to all of this been? Threats, nothing but threats, no alternative markets offered, no deals to open new doors for Canadian farmers. Just threats to slam more doors shut with tariffs that would hurt Canadian agriculture even further. So when Canadian farmers are weighing American threats against Chinese opportunity, the choice isn't complicated. Opportunity wins every time, and it should. Let's look forward, because the implications of this deal reach well beyond 2026. Carney's government has committed to dramatically growing non-US exports by 2035. Less than a decade away. This China deal is the opening move, not the endgame. Canada will be pursuing agreements with India, the European Union, Southeast Asian nations, Latin American markets. The blueprint is clear. Build a diversified portfolio of global trade relationships, so that no single country can ever again wield the kind of economic leverage the United States has historically enjoyed over Canada. And as that diversification takes hold, the power dynamic fundamentally shifts. American threats start carrying less weight. Canada develops leverage of its own. The relationship is forced toward something resembling actual equality, because Canada will have real options and Washington will know it. This is going to reshape North American politics in ways that haven't fully registered yet. It will force American policymakers to actually treat Canada like a partner, because if they don't, they'll find themselves increasingly isolated as Canada deepens roots elsewhere. We also need to talk about Trump's specific role in this story, because his 100% tariff threat was the political catalyst that made Carney's entire strategy not just viable, but inevitable. Trump thought he was being strong. He thought he was defending American interests. What he actually did was push Canada straight into Beijing's arms. He made the case for Canadian trade diversification more powerfully than any Canadian politician ever could. Every threat, every insult, every condescending dismissal of Canadian leaders by Trump makes it easier for Carney to sell Canadians on the urgent need for independence. It transforms what might have been a controversial policy shift into basic common sense. The tragedy for American interests is that Trump and his allies simply don't grasp this dynamic. They assume that raw size and power translate automatically into compliance from smaller neighbors. They don't understand that in today's global economy, countries have genuine choices. They don't understand that threats frequently ignite the exact opposite of the intended reaction. This China deal is as much Donald Trump's creation as it is Mark Carney's. Trump made it necessary. Trump made it politically bulletproof. Trump made it urgent. And now Trump and the American economy will absorb the consequences of that spectacular miscalculation. There's a broader lesson embedded here about why economic coercion is increasingly a broken tool in the 21st century. For decades, the United States deployed economic pressure as its primary instrument of foreign policy. Sanctions, tariffs, threats of market denial. For a long stretch, it worked, because American economic dominance was so overwhelming that most countries genuinely lacked realistic alternatives. But the global economy has transformed. China has risen as a genuine counterweight. Regional trade blocs have formed and matured. Countries have diversified their partnerships and hedged their bets. Increasingly, American economic threats don't land with the force they once did. Canada's successful pivot to China, executed in open defiance of American pressure, is a textbook case study in this new reality. It demonstrates that mid-sized powers can resist American economic coercion when they've built real alternatives. And other countries are watching, learning, recalibrating. They're seeing that American threats can be weathered, that alternatives exist, that economic sovereignty is achievable even for countries that have long orbited within America's gravitational pull. The implications for American foreign policy are profound. The tools that worked for 50 years are growing blunt. American policymakers will need to adapt, or find themselves progressively unable to shape global economic arrangements the way they've long assumed was their birthright. Let me bring this back to the human level, because sometimes in the fog of trade policy and geopolitical maneuvering, we lose sight of what this actually means for real people. Canadians are exhausted from being treated as second-class neighbors, exhausted from watching American politicians casually threaten their livelihoods as a negotiating tactic, exhausted from the unspoken expectation that Canadian leaders will always put Washington's comfort ahead of Canadian interests. This China deal, and the broader diversification strategy it anchors, is fundamentally about dignity. It's about Canada demanding to be treated as an equal. It's about Canadian leaders finally standing up and saying, "Our decisions will be made for Canadians, not to keep American politicians happy." That resonates. It resonates with farmers hungry for global market access. It resonates with workers who want their country to chart its own economic course. It resonates with consumers who want affordable products, including electric vehicles. It resonates with citizens who are proud of Canada and bone-tired of watching it get pushed around. Carney understands this at a gut level. He understands that standing firm against American pressure isn't just sound policy. It's what Canadians are hungry for. They want a prime minister who will fight for Canadian interests even when that means defying Washington. And that is precisely what he is delivering. There's an environmental thread running through this that deserves to be pulled, because it connects directly to the EV component of the deal. Canada has set ambitious climate targets. Achieving them requires a rapid, widespread shift to electric vehicles, but if EVs remain financially out of reach for most Canadian families, that shift simply won't happen fast enough to matter. By opening the market to affordable Chinese EVs, the Carney government is putting that transition within reach for ordinary people, not just the wealthy early adopters who could already afford it. That means faster emissions reductions. That means Paris Agreement commitments become achievable rather than aspirational. That means Canada can genuinely claim climate leadership. Meanwhile, the United States, with protectionist tariffs keeping Chinese EV prices artificially inflated, is actively dragging its feet on its own clean energy transition. Higher prices mean slower adoption. Slower adoption means emissions fall less quickly. Slower emissions reduction means climate targets slip further out of reach. This isn't just bad for the planet, it's counterproductive even by America's own stated goals. Canada chose the path that actually works. America chose the path that protects incumbents at the planet's expense. So where does this all land from here? Because we're watching this in real time and the next moves carry enormous weight. The ball is firmly in America's court. Does Trump actually pull the trigger on 100% tariffs? If he does, he launches a trade war that inflicts far greater damage on American businesses and consumers than on Canada. Because the integrated supply chains running between these two countries cut in both directions, Canadian exports would face massive tariffs heading south. Yes, but American imports from Canada would vanish, triggering supply chain chaos, price spikes, and shortages that would echo through the American economy. The more likely outcome is a flood of angry rhetoric from Washington, some targeted retaliatory measures, and a quiet retreat from the most extreme threats, which will itself be a public demonstration of eroded American credibility. For Canada, the strategy writes itself: keep diversifying, keep building, keep signing agreements with China, Europe, India, Southeast Asia, Latin America. Keep reducing the gravitational pull of the American market. so that American threats carry less and less weight with each passing year. The trajectory is set, the momentum is real. There's also a credibility dimension here that's worth examining carefully. When a country issues ultimatums and then either backs down or follows through in ways that hurt itself more than the target, it loses something precious. The credibility that makes future threats meaningful. Trump threatened 100% tariffs if Canada signed this deal. Canada signed it. Now what? If Trump retreats, the bluff is called and on the record. If he follows through, the economic self-harm makes the whole gambit look reckless and foolish. Either way, American credibility takes a hit. Canada, by contrast, said it would not be intimidated. And it wasn't. That kind of follow-through builds a reputation. And reputation is one of the most durable assets in international relations. Some will ask whether this strains the broader US-Canada relationship, whether trade friction bleeds into security cooperation, intelligence sharing, the deeper architecture of the alliance. It's a fair question, but here's the thing. Alliances function best between equals. When one partner assumes it can issue demands and expect compliance, that's not an alliance. That's dominance with diplomatic packaging. What Canada is insisting on is genuine partnership, one built on mutual respect, rather than one country's ability to economically coerce the other. That might create friction in the short term, but it builds something more durable over time. And the United States cannot credibly demand Canadian loyalty in security matters while treating Canada as a subordinate in economic ones. This deal is Canada sending that message in the clearest possible terms. Whether Washington receives it and adjusts accordingly remains the open question. Let me pull all of this together, because what we are witnessing is genuinely historic. Not in the inflated, overused sense of the word, but in the literal sense that this moment will be studied and cited for decades. Canada just proved that a mid-sized democracy can defy American economic pressure when it has the will and the alternatives to do so. Mark Carney looked at Donald Trump's 100% tariff threat, one of the most aggressive economic ultimatums issued by an American president to a close ally in modern history, and signed the deal anyway. The agreement is done. Canadian farmers already have expanded access to Chinese markets. Canadian consumers are about to have access to affordable electric vehicles. The diversification strategy is no longer a plan, it's a reality. Meanwhile, American threats lie exposed and ineffective. The pressure campaign didn't just fail. It backfired so completely that it became the driving political force behind the very outcome it was designed to prevent. Instead of stopping the China deal, Trump's ultimatums made the deal politically essential, publicly justified, and nationally celebrated. This is a watershed. The economic order that has defined North America for generations is cracking. Canada is stepping into its own sovereignty. America is discovering the limits of dominance. And the rest of the world is watching every move, drawing its own conclusions, and making its own plans. For Canadians, this is a moment to hold on to. Your government defended you. Your Prime Minister refused to fold. Your country is charting a course based on Canadian priorities, not American demands. For Americans, particularly those who have cheered on the threats and the bluster and the aggressive posturing, this should register as a wake-up call. That approach isn't working. It's pushing allies away, strengthening rivals, and leaving the United States more isolated. A different approach, one grounded in partnership rather than pressure, is desperately needed. Whether that lesson gets learned in Washington is another question entirely. But regardless of what Washington decides, Canada is already in motion. The deal is signed. The strategy is underway. The era of economic subordination is ending. That's what just happened. That's what it means. And that's why this matters far beyond the realm of trade agreements and tariff schedules. This is Canada saying enough is enough. This is Canada choosing its own future. And right now, Canada is winning.